But yeah, so it's been an interesting unfolding since GDPR has become into full force and effect, whatever that means. But needless to say, the industry has definitely reacted, as they always do. So let's jump right on in. What is GDPR? Well, the general translation is General Data Protection Regulation. I always get the P mixed up with other things. I think privacy, but it's really not. And so what it really is it's a right to be forgotten law, which sounds great on paper and on the news. However, it is a travesty in application. So it's generally designed to protect data and privacy. However, if you've actually sat down and read the ridiculous amount of text that it gives, it doesn't really protect either well. So, why do I care about GDPR? I'm from the US. Well, quite simply, I've got several projects where I actively mine the entire planet's data. Pretty much anything you put on the internet, I read it. Absolutely, I just sit there and read the internet all day. No, I have millions of bots that farm all this data. I could really care less what most of you do with 99% of your lives. It's that 0.0000001% that I actually care about. And that's for two programs. I have one that's a women and children's anti-sex trafficking project where I actively look for people on the internet that seem or are highly likely to be exposed to or involved with sex trafficking. And the other one is child and spouse abuse. And so those are two very, very kindred projects of mine. I have personal attachments to both. So people getting in the way of this, for me, I take it personally. The other is the fact that the way the law is drafted, it was never actually intended to protect your privacy, which is why there's a laundry list of organizations, if you actually read the exemption status, that are completely immune to the law. So it's not actually about your privacy. It never really was. If you look at the historical performance in the laws that have been passed and the legal actions that have been taken against U.S. companies over the past 15 years by the EU, primarily 4 countries, Germany, Spain, France, and the UK, it's mostly been about hitting U.S. companies for billions of dollars in damage. And that's just to load their pockets. And then there's, like I said, I actively monitor about half the planet. So it's a huge pain in my side when it gets in the way, and it wastes terabytes of data. So it's more frustrating than anything else. So getting into the fun sections of the GDPR and what it really does. So it's designed to be indirect and direct. They made incredibly vague language. What that means is indirect and direct. This is a Coke bottle. I drink Coke. It also conveniently happens to have a water bottle on the table. I don't drink water all the time, but by default, as per GDPR, I drink water, Coke, urine, whatever else is on this table, wax, pledge, because I drink everything on the table. So they just kind of went and just said, we're going to scoop up everything with 2 words, direct or indirect. Now, what that translates to is anything that directly or indirectly relates to you or systems that you use, whether it is direct or indirect, if it pertains even remotely to you. So that includes IP addresses, MAC addresses, host names, GPS data, images, files, pretty much anything and everything that could ever be attributed to you. If it can be attributable or if it can be assigned, it's definitely included. So what that also did, unfortunately, because they used the term groups, it also scooped up companies. Because companies are collectives or groups of individuals cooperating together with a financial objective in mind. And obviously individuals that are also outside of the EU. And so you've got your Twitters, your Googles, your Facebooks, projects like mine, all kinds of really interesting things, ISIS, terrorist organizations. But then we get into the fun parts, the does nots. It does not require them to be EU citizens from point A to point Z. So say, for instance, me as a U.S. citizen, I randomly decide I'm going to move to Belgium. You now have to delete 29 years of data on me and every project I've ever been affiliated with. Or if, I conveniently start a business in 27 countries. Do we still count the UK? in the EU? I'm still trying to get that vibe from the community if they still count the EU and the UK as one collective there. You know, that nasty divorce mom and dad are going through. So, it does not actually require the full condition of citizenship. It also doesn't stipulate what that means. Does citizenship mean a resident, a legal resident, a permanent resident, visitor? They never actually defined that in the documentation. They just kind of referred to other laws that are other laws that are other laws, but there's no actual like blanket definition that says this is what is and is not. So, then we get into the other fun things. They didn't distinguish between corporations and groups. Your band is effectively a company, is effectively a person. So, but what they did distinguish between was governments, law enforcement agencies, and NGOs, and the partial or full protection, which distinctively defines the fact that A, they don't really care about your privacy, and B, they didn't really think about what these could be. In the US, we have a serious issue with malicious nonprofits, but they didn't bother to look over across the pond, so to speak. And the other part they completely forgot to realize is contractors, third parties, and independent researchers that they forgot to protect. So the fascinating thing, these guys are immune to, say, for instance, ISIS sending in a GDPR request. But if I say, okay, well, I can't ask the FBI for my data, let me go talk to Lockheed Martin instead, the people who actually mine it, because they're not immune, unfortunately. So, why did it fail? So GDPR has barely been out for a full year, and it's already blown up to pieces. Well, let's start with the basics. Criminals tend not to follow laws. I know it's mind-blowing for governments. They really struggle with this one, but criminals, there's like a prerequisite or something to be one of those. It's definitely got to be something with government, I'm sure. I'm sure that can be regulated away. No big deal. Compliance is incredibly complicated. When we start actually looking at the documentation, and you ask any 10 GDPR experts in the room, we can just pick 10. Anybody want to volunteer for the onslaught? Nobody? Nobody? Oh, come on. That would have been so much fun. So if you ask any generic GDPR consultancy and you ask them about question A, and then you take that same question to 9 other people, you will never get the same answer. And it's a 50-50 shot of being right or being wrong. And that's the outstanding thing about the interpretation of the law because of excessively vagueness. That's the only thing that all 10 of them agree on, is that it's exceptionally vague and no one's tested the waters to the fullest extent. Now, where we really start getting into hot waters, territorial-wise, is where you have jurisdiction or jurisprudence in the U.S., where you have the authority to enact a law or enforce a penalty more specifically, because let's face it, no one cares about the law, they care about the penalty. I could care less with the first 97 pages. I care about that one paragraph of, am I going to go to jail? Am I going to get fined? Am I going to get tomatoes thrown at me or forced to tie my giraffe to some other pole? We have interesting laws in the U.S. Another one that's really interesting that I'm looking to test the waters with personally is tort law. So in the U.S. and other countries, if you're a party, and he's a party, and they're a party, and you two sign a contract, and you're executing this contract, no problem, all of a sudden the guy in the back decides, I want to get involved, and block you from doing what you're doing, and interfere with your business and cause financial harm to you in the process. That triggers what is called a tort law. Because you are not a party to that arrangement and you have intentionally interfered and you have no authority, getting back to jurisprudence, you are now in violation of tort law, which makes you susceptible to litigations and potentially criminal charges. And that's the fascinating thing about it. The EU has no authority in the US and pretty much anywhere in over 90% of the countries in the world. So that's definitely going to pop up eventually in the news. The other one is when you start talking to politicians, and this is a really big one for me, and I've actually actively been engaged with politicians on a regular basis to deal with bad laws. SB 315 was one of them. Politicians really don't understand pretty much anything as the general rule of thumb. And they always hire the specialist. The specialist is normally somebody who stands to make a financial gain from giving them advice, which is a great idea for half the group. Normally, it screws the other side. And this is exactly what this has done on the 3,000% increase in month over month of companies now doing GDPR consulting, which is phenomenal. I'm openly expecting licensing and regulation on that anytime now from like ICS or somebody. So when you start looking at the law, again, it gets back to the design. If you look at the design, like for instance, one that I really find annoying is images and control of images. Who actually owns the image? Well, that's a great question. I download images on the internet all the time for programs, and it's very difficult to find out who actually owns that image. Well, according to GDPR, if they're in that image, they could put in a request and say, hey, we want you to remove the image. My question is, how do I verify them? How do I know it's them? How do I know you didn't just steal someone's passport and are using it? Websites have these issues all the time. It's almost impossible to enforce. Then another really interesting point is, data is not copyright protectable, nor can it be trademarked, nor can it be an intellectual property. Your operating system is an intellectual property. You can copyright that. You can copyright source code. You can't copyright that this bottle is red, unfortunately for Coca-Cola and pretty much everyone else, because almost all sodas are red, orange, or blue. So, what was the response? And this gets into the fun stuff. One was a global ban. I think 30% of all media companies right now just don't allow you in the EU to access their data, because it's easier to simply say rejected than it is to actually be compliant. The other one is a systematic waiver. So what ends up happening is your access becomes contractually bound to the country in which the server already resides, which was normal law before, but now it's actually in the agreement, and you say that you're going to forfeit your rights to GDPR protections in exchange for using the service. Fascinating problem, because the implemented policies, that actually violates GDPR law. So really fascinating there. Then you get into the other fun parts, which is people are moving to subscription models only for EU users, where you're going to have to pay for something that literally everyone else in the world gets for free, and you're suffering from substantial losses of businesses as businesses are leaving the EU to avoid compliance requirements where they're shifting it overseas into cheaper areas. Then two projects of mine, one is the Banhammer project, which systematically blocks all EU nations from accessing any of your systems, which is free, and Operation Black Flag and Helios, where me and about 6,000 other people have collectively gotten together, and we're systematically building complaints and filings to hit companies for billions of dollars in damage. So that, or you can use Helios and we just help you move your company for free. So you can face an existential crisis, or we can help you relocate for no charge. Two really interesting issues. And then a lot of people are just simply ignoring it. And it's like, hey, you have to be compliant, and they're just like, okay. And that's about it. So this is actually one of my data system projects. This is what it looks like. I don't know if Australia is actually part of the EU. I don't really go there, honestly. Kangaroos, man. Spiders. I avoid it. And so this is how you actually weaponize it. It's incredibly simple. Say you are a malware developer. Since your data is protected, you simply scope out all the security companies that you think might have your data. You file a formal complaint. You wait 30 days, you verify that it's gone, and you either have now destroyed all the evidence they could use in prosecutions against you, or you can actually sue them. You can sue them for protecting people, which is going to eventually end up in astronomically large malware outbreaks, obliterating, 10% of the entire globe. Anybody got any questions? Yes, sure. Right now, I've collectively gotten together with friends of mine on multiple hacking forums who may or may not openly develop malware. Collectively, I've compiled 6,000 complaints already, and I'm going to systematically send them all at once over to companies like ThreatGrid, FireEye, Cisco, who else? Deloitte, other companies that actively mine this data, independent researchers, and effectively, it's an immediate boot and nuke option, which is you can either kicked out of the country and comply with our request and we file a quick claim, or you can face, right now, FireEye's looking at $1.5 billion in immediate losses. Yes? Oh, you drafted in writing. IP information, artifacts, checksums, images, anything you have, the dossiers on the individuals, pretty much the entire collective intellectual property portfolio that they sell. Because they all do it based on the data that they have. They can have the source code, they just can't have any of the data. Yes? Well, here's the catch-22 on that, and the problem with that assessment and assumption is, one, you actually have to have an active law enforcement case in order to have a legal hold. You can't just hold things. You actually have to have justification to do that, unless you're in a country that doesn't have a data law. And so if I send you a GDPR deletion request, you have 30 days to be compliant, which means within 30 days, law enforcement has to send you a subpoena that specifically says, hold my data. Otherwise, you're legally required to delete it. And that's where we get into issues of law enforcement where people automatically assume we must keep the data. You can't legally keep the data. If you're told to delete it by GDPR compliance, you're required to. And that's where it's going to screw up.
Right, apologies. So
I'll
you'll
answer
be
questions
able
in the hall.
to ask all the questions in the cooler. So thank you, Logan,
Absolutely.
for presenting.